Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had developed an emotional armor that allowed him to handle whatever stories contestants brought to the stage. He had witnessed confessions, revelations, and touching moments of every kind, always managing to maintain his professional composure even when deeply moved. But on that warm April afternoon in 2025, an 88-year-old woman named Rose Thompson would tell a story of love and sacrifice so extraordinary, so selfless and heartbreaking, that Steve would be rendered completely speechless, standing frozen on stage with tears streaming down his face, unable to find a single word to respond to what he had just heard. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Anderson family from Florida and the Thompson family from North Carolina. The Thompson family drew immediate attention because at their center stood Rose Thompson, a petite 88-year-old woman with snow-white hair styled in soft curls, bright blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a gentle grace in her movements despite her age. She wore a powder blue dress with a pearl necklace, and there was something about her presence, a combination of kindness and profound sadness, that suggested she carried a story of great weight. Her family surrounded her with obvious devotion, 3 generations including her 2 sons in their early 60s, her grandchildren in their 30s and 40s, and her great-grandchildren ranging from toddlers to teenagers. Notably absent was any mention of Rose's husband, and the producers had noted during the pre-interview that when asked about him, Rose had simply said, "He's no longer with us," with an expression that suggested the loss was still fresh despite what must have been years since his passing. During the pre-interview, Rose had been charming and articulate, answering questions with a quiet wit and showing genuine excitement about being on the show with her family. When asked what had made her want to apply to Family Feud, she had said something that seemed innocuous at the time but would later take on profound meaning. "My husband always said that if I outlived him, I should keep living fully, should keep making memories with our family, should keep finding joy. This seemed like the kind of joyful thing he would have wanted me to do." The producers had smiled at this sweet sentiment, not realizing the depth of story behind those simple words. Rose's sons, when asked about their father, had become emotional and said simply that he had been an extraordinary man who had loved their mother completely, but they had not elaborated, and the producers had not pressed, assuming it was simply the normal grief of losing a beloved parent. The Thompson family won their game with strong teamwork, Rose contributing a few perfect answers that made Steve compliment her sharpness and making jokes about how she was showing up the younger contestants. As they lined up for fast money, Rose insisted on being one of the 2 players despite her son's gentle suggestion that perhaps one of the grandchildren should play instead. "I'm here to play," Rose said with surprising firmness, "and there's a reason I need to be standing at that podium." Something in her tone suggested this was more than just wanting to participate in a game, and her family, recognizing that tone, stepped back. Rose's grandson went first and scored 185 points, which meant Rose needed only 15 points to win the $20,000 virtually guaranteed. But as Rose slowly approached the podium, Steve noticed that her hands were trembling and that tears were forming in her eyes before he had asked a single question. Steve's professional instincts told him something significant was happening, and he approached Rose gently, saying, "Mrs. Thompson, you all right? You need a minute before we start." Rose shook her head but didn't speak immediately, seeming to gather herself. The studio fell quiet, everyone sensing that this moment was about to become something other than a typical fast money round. Finally, Rose looked up at Steve and said in a voice that quavered with emotion, "Mr. Harvey, before we play this game, I need to tell you why I'm really here. I need to tell you about my husband Harold and what he did to save my life, because he made me promise that if I ever had the chance to tell people about what real love looks like, I would do it, and standing here on television with my family around me seems like the chance he meant." Steve's expression shifted from casual warmth to deep attentiveness, and he said quietly, "Okay, ma'am. Whatever you need to share, we're listening." Rose took a shaky breath and turned to address not just Steve but the cameras and audience as well. What she said next would render Steve completely speechless, would stop the show entirely, and would ultimately become one of the most powerful testimonies about love, sacrifice, and the depths of human devotion ever shared on television. Rose said, her voice breaking, "My husband Harold died 7 years ago, in 2018, at the age of 83. But he should have died in 1989, when he was 54 years old. The only reason he lived those extra 29 years was because he gave me one of his kidneys, and that transplant, while it saved my life, ultimately destroyed his health and led to his death. He sacrificed his own future so I could have won, and I need people to understand what that kind of love looks like, what it costs, and how I've lived every day since trying to be worthy of that gift." The gasps that went through the studio were immediate and visceral, and Steve's face showed a complex mixture of shock, sadness, and profound emotion. Rose continued, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I need to tell you the whole story, if you'll let me, because it's important. In 1988, I was 53 years old, and I was diagnosed with kidney failure. My kidneys were shutting down because of a genetic condition I didn't know I had, and the doctors told me I would need dialysis and would eventually need a transplant if one could be found. I went on the transplant waiting list, but the wait times were years, and my health was deteriorating rapidly. I started dialysis, which is a grueling process that left me exhausted and sick, and I watched my life shrink down to doctor's appointments and treatments and feeling terrible all the time. Harold watched me suffer for months, and I could see it was destroying him to see me that way, to see the strong, vibrant woman he had married becoming weaker and sicker." Rose paused, her hands gripping the podium, and Steve moved closer to her, ready to support her physically if needed, but also clearly struggling with his own emotions. Rose continued, "In early 1989, Harold told me he wanted to get tested to see if he could donate a kidney to me. I refused immediately. I told him it was too dangerous, that I couldn't let him risk his health for me, that I would wait on the transplant list like everyone else. But Harold was insistent. He said, 'Rose, I can't watch you die when I have the power to save you. I have 2 kidneys and I only need one. Please let me do this.' We argued about it for weeks. I kept saying no, kept telling him I couldn't let him take that risk, but he kept pushing, kept saying that if our situations were reversed I would do it for him without hesitation, and he was right, I would have. Finally, he got tested without telling me, and when the results came back showing he was a perfect match, he presented it to me as a fait accompli. He said, 'I'm doing this whether you agree or not, because I love you and I'm not losing you when I can prevent it.'" The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people crying, and Steve Harvey's face was wet with tears, though he hadn't moved or spoken, simply standing there absorbing Rose's story. Rose said, "The transplant happened in May 1989. Harold donated his left kidney to me, and the surgery was successful. His kidney started working immediately in my body, and within weeks I felt better than I had in over a year. I came off dialysis, I regained my strength, I was able to go back to living a normal life. Harold recovered from the surgery, and for a while everything seemed fine. The doctors said he was healthy, that living with one kidney shouldn't cause him any problems, that people donate kidneys all the time and go on to live completely normal lives. And I believed them, and I thought Harold's sacrifice had been this beautiful gift that cost him nothing beyond a few weeks of recovery. But I was wrong." Rose's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and everyone in the studio leaned forward to hear her. She said, "What the doctors didn't fully explain, or maybe didn't fully understand in 1989, was that living with one kidney instead of 2 puts extra strain on the remaining kidney, and that over time this can lead to complications, especially if the donor develops any kind of kidney disease or if other health problems emerge. Harold developed high blood pressure a few years after the donation, which is a known risk factor for kidney disease. His one remaining kidney had to work twice as hard as a normal kidney, and over the years that extra strain began to damage it. By the time he was in his late 60s, his remaining kidney was showing signs of disease. By his mid-70s, his kidney function was declining significantly, and by the time he was 80, he was in kidney failure himself, the same condition he had saved me from 30 years earlier. The horror and tragedy of what Rose was describing settled over the studio like a weight, and Steve finally moved, sitting down on the stage floor because his legs seemed unable to hold him up anymore, his face buried in his hands as he cried. Rose continued, her voice steady despite her tears. Harold needed dialysis, the same grueling treatment I had endured, and unlike me, he didn't have someone who could donate a kidney to him. Our sons were tested, but neither was a match. I was tested, desperate to give him back what he had given me, but I couldn't donate because I was living on his kidney and my body couldn't handle another surgery. We went on the transplant waiting list, but Harold was in his 80s and had other health problems by then, and he wasn't a priority candidate. So he did dialysis for 3 years, and I watched the man who had saved my life slowly deteriorate from the same disease he had saved me from. The irony was unbearable and the guilt I felt was crushing. I was alive and healthy because of Harold's kidney, which was working perfectly in my body, while his remaining kidney had failed from the strain of being the only one, and I couldn't do anything to help him. Rose paused and looked directly at Steve, who was still sitting on the stage floor crying, and she said, "Mr. Harvey, I need you to understand that Harold never once expressed regret. Not once did he say he wished he hadn't donated his kidney to me. Even when he was on dialysis, even when he was suffering, he would tell me, 'Rose, giving you that kidney was the best thing I ever did. You've had 29 extra years of good health, 29 years of watching our sons grow up, and our grandchildren be born, and our family flourish, and every one of those years was worth what I'm going through now. If I could go back and make the choice again, I would make the same choice without hesitation.'" He said that to me over and over during those final years, and I think he could see that I was drowning in guilt, and he was trying to absolve me, trying to make me understand that his sacrifice had been freely given and that he had no regrets. Steve finally found his voice, though it was shaking and barely audible, and he said, "Mrs. Thompson, your husband sounds like one of the most remarkable men who ever lived." Rose nodded and said, "Was Mr. Harvey. He really was. Harold died in March 2018 from complications related to his kidney failure and dialysis. He was 83 years old, and he died holding my hand, and the last thing he said to me was, 'Every extra day with you was worth it, Rose. Don't you dare waste the years I gave you feeling guilty. Live fully, love completely, and tell people our story so they understand what real love looks like.' Those were his last words to me, Mr. Harvey, and I promised him I would honor them. I promised him I would live fully, which I've tried to do even though part of me died with him. And I promised him I would tell our story if I ever had the chance, so people would understand that real love isn't just feeling or saying I love you, but being willing to sacrifice yourself completely for the person you love." Rose turned to her sons and grandchildren, all of whom were crying, and she said, "Your father and grandfather gave me 29 extra years. I got to see you boys finish college and start careers and get married and have children of your own. I got to meet all of my grandchildren and watch them grow up. I got to see 2 of my great-grandchildren be born. I've had 29 years of life that I wouldn't have had without Harold's kidney, and every single one of those days has been lived with the knowledge that Harold paid for them with his own health and eventually his own life. The guilt of that is something I carry every moment, but I also carry the responsibility to make those years meaningful, to live in a way that honors his sacrifice, and to make sure people know what he did and what it cost him." Steve Harvey was still sitting on the stage floor, and he tried several times to speak but couldn't form words, simply shaking his head in amazement and grief at what he was hearing. Rose continued, "The reason I came on this show, the reason I'm standing here today, is because Harold always loved Family Feud. We watched it together for years, and he would joke about how much fun it would be to be on the show with the whole family. After he died, our sons suggested we apply, and I said yes because it seemed like a way to honor Harold's memory and to do something joyful like he wanted me to do. But I also came because I knew that if I got on this stage, I would have a platform to tell Harold's story, to make sure people know what he did and who he was. And I wanted to tell this story publicly because I think people need to understand what real sacrificial love looks like, especially in a world where love is often treated as just a feeling or a romantic notion rather than a choice and an action and sometimes a sacrifice. One of Rose's sons, a man in his early 60s named David, stepped forward and said, his voice thick with emotion, "Mom, we never knew you carried this guilt. Dad made his choice freely, and we all know he would make it again. You don't need to feel guilty for being alive." Rose looked at her son with infinite sadness and said, "I know intellectually that your father made his choice freely and that he never regretted it. But emotionally, David, I will carry the weight of his sacrifice until the day I die, because I'm alive, because he's not, and that's not something you can just rationalize away. Every morning I wake up, I'm aware that I'm breathing because Harold gave me his kidney. Every time I see you or your brother or my grandchildren, I'm aware that I'm here to see you because Harold made a choice that ultimately cost him his life. That awareness is both a burden and a gift, because it reminds me constantly not to waste the time he gave me, but it's also heavy to carry, knowing that my life came at the cost of his." Steve finally managed to speak, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Thompson, how did you go on after he died? How did you find the strength to keep living when you were carrying that weight?" Rose smiled sadly and said, "I kept living because Harold asked me to, because breaking the promise I made to him would have dishonored his sacrifice. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Harvey, there were days, especially in the first year after he died, when I wanted to stop. When the guilt felt unbearable and I thought, maybe I should have refused the kidney in the first place, should have let nature take its course with me, rather than costing Harold his health and his life. But then I would remember him saying, 'Don't waste the years I gave you,' and I would force myself to get up, to engage with my family, to find moments of joy, to keep living as fully as I could manage, because anything less would have made his sacrifice meaningless." Rose paused, and then said something that would become one of the most quoted parts of her story. "I want people to understand that Harold's decision to donate his kidney to me wasn't romantic or easy or simple. It was a conscious choice to potentially sacrifice his own future for mine. He didn't know for certain that it would lead to his kidney failure 30 years later, but he accepted the risk because he loved me more than he feared what might happen to him. That's what real love looks like. Not just feeling affection or enjoying someone's company, but being willing to sacrifice yourself for their well-being. And I want people, especially young people, to understand that if you're lucky enough to find that kind of love, you treasure it, you honor it, and you live in a way that's worthy of it. That's what I've tried to do for the last 7 years, and that's what I'll keep trying to do for however many years I have left." Steve finally stood up, wiping his face, and he approached Rose and did something he had never done in thousands of episodes. He asked permission to embrace her, and when she nodded, he held her carefully while they both cried. When he finally stepped back, Steve looked at the camera and said, his voice still shaking, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have words for what we just heard. Mrs. Thompson's husband Harold gave her his kidney, which gave her 29 extra years of life, but ultimately led to his own kidney failure and death. He sacrificed his future so she could have one, and he did it without regret, and she's been living with both the gift of that sacrifice and the weight of it for over 30 years. This is one of the most profound demonstrations of love I've ever heard, and I'm honored beyond words that she chose to share it here." Steve turned to Rose and said, "Ma'am, you're not playing fast money. Your family is getting the $20,000 regardless, and I'm personally adding another $50,000 from my foundation to honor Harold's memory and to support you and your family however you choose to use it. But more importantly, I want to make sure Harold's story is told properly and reaches as many people as possible, because what he did, and what you've carried since, is something people need to hear about." Rose nodded gratefully and said, "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. But I need to say one more thing, if you'll let me." Steve nodded, and Rose turned to face the camera directly and said, "If you have someone in your life who would sacrifice everything for you, or if you would sacrifice everything for someone you love, tell them. Don't assume they know. Harold and I told each other we loved each other every day, and I'm grateful for that, But I wish I had thanked him more explicitly for what he gave up for me. I wish I had told him more often how much his sacrifice meant, how grateful I was, how extraordinary I thought he was. Don't wait. If someone loves you the way Harold loved me, make sure they know you see it and appreciate it and understand the magnitude of what they've given you. The episode that aired was expanded into a special that included Rose's full story, medical expert commentary about living kidney donation and the potential long-term risks to donors, interviews with transplant specialists about how the field has evolved since 1989 and what donors are now told about risks, and testimony from other families who had experienced similar situations where a kidney donation had ultimately led to the donor's kidney failure years later. The special also included a segment on the ethics of living organ donation, the balance between saving one life immediately while potentially putting the donor at risk long-term, and how doctors and families navigate these complex decisions. Throughout the special, Harold Thompson's photograph was shown frequently, a handsome man with kind eyes and a warm smile, the image of someone who had loved so completely that he had willingly sacrificed his own future. The response to Rose's story was enormous and profoundly emotional. The show received hundreds of thousands of messages from viewers, many from kidney donors and recipients sharing their own experiences, others from people who had lost loved ones to kidney disease, and still others from people who were simply moved by the depth of love that Harold had shown and that Rose continued to honor. Organ donation organizations reported a massive spike in people signing up as organ donors, saying that Harold's story had inspired them to want to help save lives even though they understood the potential risks. Living kidney donor programs received increased inquiries from people wanting to donate to loved ones, though transplant centers emphasized the importance of careful evaluation and informed consent about potential long-term risks. Medical professionals used Rosie's story to discuss how understanding of living kidney donation had evolved since 1989. They explained that while the surgery itself is relatively safe and most living donors go on to live normal, healthy lives with one kidney, there are some donors who experience complications years later, including high blood pressure, protein in the urine, and in rare cases, kidney failure in the remaining kidney. They emphasized that modern screening procedures are more rigorous than they were in the 1980s, that donors are now followed more carefully long-term, and that anyone considering living donation needs to understand both the immediate risks and the potential for long-term complications. Some doctors used Harold's case as an example of why living donation, while often life-saving for recipients, requires serious consideration and shouldn't be romanticized as a simple or risk-free gift. The kidney transplant community had varied responses to Rosie's story. Many transplant recipients and donor families resonated deeply with Rosie's description of living with both gratitude for the gift and guilt about the sacrifice, saying this complicated emotional response was common but rarely discussed openly. Others worried that Rose's story might discourage people from living donation by emphasizing the risks rather than the more common outcome of donors living long, healthy lives. Transplant organizations worked to balance these concerns, acknowledging that Harold's case represented a real but relatively rare outcome, while also emphasizing that the vast majority of living kidney donors do not experience kidney failure and that living donation remains one of the most effective treatments for kidney disease. They used Rose and Harold's story not to discourage donation, but to ensure that potential donors were fully informed about all potential risks and made their decisions with complete understanding. Rose became an unexpected advocate for living organ donors, working with transplant organizations to ensure that donors received lifelong follow-up care and that potential long-term complications were caught and treated early. She spoke publicly about the need to honor donors, not just at the time of donation but throughout their lives, and to ensure that if donors did experience complications related to their donation, they received the medical care and support they needed. She also advocated for more research into why some donors experience complications while others don't, hoping that better understanding might allow doctors to predict and prevent adverse outcomes. In all of her advocacy work, Rose emphasized that she wasn't arguing against living donation, which had given her 29 precious extra years. but rather arguing for better informed consent, better long-term care for donors, and more honest conversations about the complex ethical and emotional dimensions of living donation. Rose lived for 2 more years after her appearance on Family Feud, dying peacefully in her sleep in April 2027 at the age of 90. In those final 2 years, she continued her advocacy work, remained deeply connected to her family, and according to those close to her, seemed to have made some peace with the guilt she had carried for so long. Her sons reported that in her final months, Rose spoke often about seeing Harold again soon, and that she seemed less burdened by guilt and more focused on gratitude for the years they had shared and for the 29 extra years his kidney had given her. She said in one of her final interviews, "I'm ready to see Harold again, and the first thing I'm going to do is thank him again for giving me all that extra time, and then I'm going to spend eternity showing him how much that gift meant by telling him every day that I love him and that he was the best man I ever knew." Rose's funeral was attended by her large family, by transplant professionals she had worked with in her advocacy, and by numerous kidney donors and recipients who had been moved by her story. Her sons gave eulogies that honored both their mother and their father, describing Rose's strength in carrying the weight of Harold's sacrifice and her determination to live in a way that honored his gift. They shared that Rose had requested her epitaph read, "Beloved wife of Harold Thompson, who gave me everything, including an extra 38 years, counting both the 29 years she had lived after the transplant while Harold was alive and the 9 years she had lived after his death." Rose was buried next to Harold, their graves marked with matching stones that acknowledged their extraordinary love, and included on both stones was a notation that they were organ donation advocates, ensuring that even in death they would encourage others to consider the gift of donation. Steve Harvey attended Rose's funeral, and he spoke about how her story had changed him, had given him a deeper understanding of sacrificial love, and had reminded him that behind medical procedures and statistics were real people making profound choices out of love and living with the complex consequences of those choices. He said that the moment when Rose had told him about Harold's sacrifice, the moment when he had been literally unable to speak and had sat down on the stage floor because the weight of her story was too much to bear standing up, had been the most powerful moment of his professional life. He continued to support organ donation advocacy in Harold and Rose's names, and he frequently told their story when speaking about love, sacrifice, and what it means to truly give everything for someone else. The story of Harold and Rose Thompson became a powerful and complicated testimony about love, sacrifice, organ donation, and the ways we honor those who give us everything. It showed that profound love sometimes requires profound sacrifice, that gifts given freely can still be heavy to receive, and that living with gratitude, while carrying guilt, is a complex emotional reality for many transplant recipients whose donors experience complications. It illustrated that medical decisions made out of love can have consequences that unfold over decades in ways no one can predict, and that these complex outcomes require honest acknowledgement rather than simple celebration or regret. And it demonstrated that honoring someone's sacrifice means living fully with the gift they gave, speaking their truth, and working to ensure that future donors and recipients understand the complete picture of what living donation entails. In the end, Rose's story wasn't just about Harold's sacrifice, though that was extraordinary. It was also about Rose's courage in living with that sacrifice, in carrying both the gift and the guilt for 38 years, in making her life meaningful enough to honor what Harold had given up, and in finally telling their story publicly so that others could understand what real sacrificial love looks like. It was about the complexity of emotions that can't be easily resolved, being grateful for life while grieving the cost at which that life came, loving someone for their sacrifice while wishing they hadn't had to make it, and living fully while carrying the weight of knowing your life was bought with someone else's future. These tensions had no resolution, no simple moral, no easy answers. They were simply the reality that Rose had lived with since 1989, the reality she had shared publicly in 2025, and the reality that she had finally been released from when she died in 2027 and was, in her family's words, finally reunited with the man who loved her enough to give her everything, including his own tomorrow.